Good afternoon. Thank you for joining us for the Inner Healing Through Grief and Loss webinar. My name is Crystal Reynolds, and I am the Director of Marketing and Communications for the Family Institute at Northwestern University, where we, through research, education, and therapy, practice relationship-based behavioral healthcare and are committed to strengthening and healing children, adolescents, families, and individuals from all walks of life. Today's panel discussion is led by Dr. Brenna Moore, who is joined by Ms. Emily Klear and Dr. Melissa Prusko. Brenna Moore is a clinical psychologist and staff therapist at the Family Institute. Dr. Moore's therapeutic training has covered many different types of clinical settings, including academic hospitals, community counseling centers, university counseling centers, K-12 schools, and veteran affairs hospitals. Dr. Moore received specialty training in individual therapy, couple therapy, trauma-focused therapies, addiction treatment, women's issues, and health psychology. On our panel, we have Emily Klear, who is a licensed marriage and family therapist and director of adult psychotherapy services at the Family Institute. Ms. Klear works with couples and adult individuals, specializing in difficult transitions to parenthood, dual income couples, and work-related issues. Her therapeutic practice is informed from her previous business career in corporate retail and management and working for privately held family businesses. And finally, we're joined by Melissa Prusko, who is a licensed clinical psychologist with the adult team at the Family Institute. She has worked in a variety of settings, including hospital emergency rooms, inpatient hospitals, jails, and residential substance treatment centers. Her primary clinical focus is trauma, treating individuals with depression, anxiety, emotional dysregulation, and grief and loss. Dr. Prusko is also committed to socially responsible therapeutic practices and understands that we cannot be understood separate from our context. Thank you all for joining, and I will pass it over to Dr. Moore.
Thank you, Crystal. It's great to be here today. To capitalize on time, I will just jump right into the questions because we've got a lot of amazing questions. So I'm going to be switching between computers or to screens. So our first question is, what are some common misconceptions about grief, and what are the differences between grief and bereavement? And either one of you can jump in to share your knowledge.
Melissa, you want to start us off?
Sure. So I kind of want to couch a little bit about what I'm going to say. First, to just acknowledge that given the topic, for just encourage people to take care of themselves as they need today, depending upon what comes up. And I also would be remiss not acknowledging what's happening in the world, especially to Israelis and Palestinians. And so especially as we are talking about grief and loss in its many forms, in the way that it shows up individually and with communities and in the world, to just please take care of yourself as you need to today throughout the panel. So with that, I think important to understand the words that we're using. So we hear about grief, we hear bereavement. Big difference between grief and bereavement. Bereavement really does correlate with the physical loss of a life. Whereas grief can be a bit more broad, and that can include things such as ambiguous loss, where the loss isn't as clearly defined. These tend to not be as socially recognized. They are considered a bit disenfranchised. Examples of this could be infertility. Examples of this could be the loss of parents through medical conditions, but they're still living. So losing somebody while they are still alive. They tend to be uncanny. They can be very unexpected, and there's no real shape to them. As when we think about the loss of a physical person, there's something very identifiable about that. Emily, I'm not sure what you'd like to add to that.
No, I think you're making an important distinction, Melissa, that we often can see grief happen in these other situations. Like divorce is one that really stands out for me, right? Both in bereavement and grief, there's this reorganization of a family when there's change, and there can be a lot of different emotions that are attached to those changes, and lots of different situations that call them up.
Yeah, that's a really important distinction. That sounds like loss of job, like loss in general. It sounds like losing something that's important to you that you care about. And
Mhm.
that spans a really broad category.
That's right. Yeah.
So yeah, I can, that leads me to my next question. How does grief affect individuals both emotionally and physically? Like, how does grief impact the family system?
Sure. So it's a really big question. And I, even in preparation for this, it's really hard to separate the person from their family systems or systems that surround them, because the loss in whatever forms can start with the individual, but it definitely radiates out. So when we think about, what are the physical and emotional manifestations of that, depends on the person. It can look like depression. It can look like someone who's functioning, they can still go to work. It can look like higher anxiety. If it's a traumatic loss, we can certainly see some PTSD that may develop from that. So what it looks like, it doesn't have a specific look.
Mhm.
And I think, kind of to actually go back to that first question, like a misconception, grief doesn't have a specific profile of what it may look like. And I think this is one of the more difficult things, is that we might say to somebody, well, it doesn't look like you're grieving. And you might question, what their experience of grief is. And so thinking about how it might impact the individual versus the family system, that encouragement to give space for how grief shows up for that person, and allowing room for that. One really big thing in the grief and loss world is being able to understand what is called the assumptive world. It's the way in which we make sense of the world. Very popular one is the just world belief. Good things happen to good people, bad things happen to bad people. When we experience a loss, whether it's ambiguous or through the death of a person, it doesn't have to, but it can violate the way that we have organized our understanding of the world and ourselves and others, and just how the world operates. And so being able to understand, what does that death mean to that person? What does this loss mean to that person? And is it consistent with how they see the world? Does it violate how they see the world? And if it's a violation, allowing space for them to have maybe anger, allowing space for them to have betrayal or disappointment, and being able to respect that there is now a new reorganization that has to happen, which encompasses its own loss.
Mhm.
The loss of what we once thought this world was, and who we are in it, and who others are.
Yeah, that's so important. And I think recognizing that each family member within a family system can have a different experience of that and have different assumptions around the world, right? And so helping make space that everybody may have different reactions and may have different feelings and different emotions at different times. In particular, children, right? I think hide death and grief and hard changes from kids, and sometimes that creates confusion for kids, and maybe unintentionally sends messages that they shouldn't be in touch with whatever emotional experience they're having with the family change or the family's loss. I think the other part that is maybe helpful to note here too, right, is like we have as a culture moved away from all or most of these historic anchors that helped people move through grief, right? Most religions have some form of ritual attached to the end of life and the loss of a life. And we have really kind of truncated that and minimized that. 100 years ago, people would outwardly wear some form of black, whether it was an armband or dress head to toe. So the rest of the world knew what was happening, right? They're in grief, they're in mourning. And now I think the hard part is we carry that individually, and that can feel really isolating and lonely.
I think important to dovetail on that too, oftentimes people question, well, what place does spirituality have in grief and loss? And it really does tie to what I was talking about with the assumptive world. Sometimes that is really what informs how we understand how this world operates. And for some people, they find strength in their religion, their spirituality, their higher power, however they come to define that. And for some people that gets really challenged, and oftentimes can also complicate it in family systems, for example, that might be very religious, and people then express anger at God or the higher power. And then family messages that might say, we don't do that. We don't grieve like that. We don't question. And can really make grief a very isolating and silenced experience that really just doubles down on something that is already really, really painful.
Right. Yeah, and you're touching on that important piece, right? Like there is no right or wrong way to grieve.
Right. And in like that there's no set path for grief, and the ambiguity around loss. I think that I remember learning from one of my professors is like we grieve so many different aspects of like the things that happened to us that shouldn't have. We grieve the things that we should have had, but we didn't get, like maybe in like our childhood. And then like we grieve like what no longer will be, a future that we thought we would have that we won't have anymore. And so like there's so many aspects of grieving a person, experience, place, all those different kinds of things.
Yeah, that's a really important part of that too, Brenna, right? Like that grieving what could have been or what should have been, right? And letting go of some of the things that we thought maybe we would have a chance for. And that makes me think of people who are diagnosed with forms of illness, right? Whether it's a chronic illness or a terminal illness, there can be a lot of grief in that process as well.
Brenna, you hit on an exercise that I actually do quite often with clients, and it's the creation of a loss list. Because of, let's say, we take the loss of a grandparent, it is the loss of a future with them. It's a loss of any future celebrations. It's a loss of, also sharing in anything that sad may have happened, just life with them. If there are any traditions, it's future vacations, it's future, impromptu adventures and trips. And when we really begin to take that step back and see the enormity of grief, I think we then can start to see what we're highlighting, like, there's no right or wrong way. There's no real set path. It's this really big experience that is active and it is ongoing.
Yeah. Absolutely. So, and that leads me to my next question, which we've kind of talked about a little bit, but curious to hear also what you think about, like, are there common themes or feelings that people experiencing grief typically go through?
That's a great question, right? I think this is where a lot of people look to those stages of grief, right, that came out, and which can be great, right? Like there can be an anchoring in that, but there can also be a feeling of like, am I doing it right? I don't feel those stages. I'm not moving through something, right? Like I'm quote unquote stuck. I've heard from a lot of clients, like, I feel like I'm stuck in anger or I'm stuck in denial. So I think there are greater themes, right? Like sadness, loneliness, fear, denial, guilt, bargaining, depression, hope, acceptance. And I really encourage clients to like lean into what they're experiencing and what they're feeling, to really guide themselves through the process. And it's okay if you're really feeling overwhelmed with one sort of theme, that's okay too, right? And I think part of grief is that we don't really it never ends. There's no closure to it. There's no finality to it. And so it's how to learn to live with that loss, whatever the loss was, and kind of integrate it into the fabric of who we are. And that's how we carry, if it's been a death, that's how we carry that person forward. But it also, I think, gives people permission that like, this isn't a task list. It's okay to just be with it and be present with it.
I think even more so when we see just how much grief touches every aspect of our life, I think invites us to hold compassion that there's going to be days where grief shows up and we didn't expect it. and that it's okay, and that the grief will look different over time. And the meaning you make of that also might change over time, and allowing that to be there. Again, it's a very active and ongoing process that we engage in.
And I see questions coming up in the chat, and we will definitely be addressing those at some point soon. And so just know that I see you, and we'll come back to that after we address some other questions. So how does the stigma associated with death by suicide or addiction impact the grieving process? You know, that can be complicated. It comes up a lot for people. So I'm curious what you two might can share about that.
Very big question, very important question. You know, my experience in this work, both personally and professionally with it, is these are deaths that tend to have a lot of stigma and judgment around them. And there's some element of morality that comes into play about how people feel about people who contemplate suicide and then die by suicide, people who struggle with addiction and succumb to addiction. And it only complicates it, both for the family and also for that individual. And we think about how to continue having a relationship with them, even though they're not physically here. They're probably the most fraught deaths that I've encountered, because they're not just grieving the death, they might be actually grieving some of their own stigmas that they had towards suicide, towards addiction. And then they're in this like really difficult space of, now I'm judging this person that I loved who's died, and they're not here for me to talk to, but I'm judging them and I'm really angry with them. Not that we don't see that with other deaths, but these tend to be a bit more complicated with that, holding these really uncomfortable thoughts and feelings about somebody that we love. And now our life has been impacted probably by something we told ourselves we'd never experience.
And I think particularly with suicide, right, it's sometimes, especially if you weren't aware the person was struggling with thoughts of suicide or had depression or any of the other things that could have been a precursor to that decision. I think there is this mourning of the person they thought they knew. I never thought this was possible. I didn't think this was who that person was. And that can happen with substances as well. I imagine there's a little bit more sometimes within families, not always, where they are aware of the substance struggle and use, versus with suicide. A lot of times it's catching a whole group of people off guard, including friends and coworkers and colleagues, that experience of, if only I had known. And so there's that, like, could I have stopped this? Could I have prevented this, with a lot of those types of death?
Right. It brings up a lot of questions that may never be answered. And a lot of uncertainty and having to make sense of something that doesn't make sense. And that can be really challenging. I mean, that goes to say with a lot of different types of loss, but yeah, definitely in particular to addiction and dying by suicide.
So really just like kind of a caveat to put in there when we talk about meaning making, I think oftentimes we actually automatically believe that, oh, I'm going to make meaning of this and therefore it will make sense. Meaning making is not synonymous with making sense. Yeah. Sometimes the meaning that we make of a death or a loss is that it does not make sense. That is the meaning that is made. So when we think then back to that idea of the assumptive world, you know, in my training, we learned the anatomy of grief. There's avoidance, there's assimilation, and then this idea of accommodation. Can I make space in how I see the world and myself and others and how it operates? Can I leave space for the fact that there's stuff that just doesn't make sense? And sometimes that is the meaning that is made. So I offer that to be gentle. I offer that to be compassionate, that you're not on an errand, like Emily said, some sort of task to complete, like, oh, I've now made this make sense. Sometimes that is the meaning. And can we sit with unanswered questions? Can I sit with that the meaning of this is that it just does not make sense?
That's so
And
helpful.
I just want to kind of caveat that a little bit, what we mean when, at least what I mean when I'm saying meaning making is like the biggest active process of grief.
Mhm. And I think that's so critical, especially in these situations we're talking about with suicide and substance use, but it's also so critical when you're talking about the loss of a young life, whether it's a child or an infant or a pregnancy. There, I think that is so important to sit in that could be what the meaning making experience is.
Yeah, thank you for bringing that up. Very, very helpful in the meaning making experience. So I'm curious, what role does time play in the healing process of grief? And like, how do you recommend managing expectations for recovering?
I think most of us who sit with clients and do therapy, right? Like time is probably the piece that is the greatest tool to having a new or different, or I don't want to use the word healed because I don't know if it ever feels healed, but like it does change grief over time, right? Like it will get it will be different. It will be hopefully maybe integrated. And that is a big goal of what I think people come to therapy when they're grieving. But I do think it changes over time, and that's one of the more helpful spots around it. But I also want to be aware that for some people it doesn't, right? I think for a lot of people who lose children, and I don't want to say it's only exclusive to this, but like to lose a child is an experience that I don't think time ever makes go away. It just maybe changes the brightness of it, or helps people feel potentially more connected to it. I think when Melissa and I were preparing for this, we talked a lot about how grief integrates into who you are. And sometimes there are things you can do to anchor yourself to feel connected to the person who's no longer with you, or the circumstance that's no longer happening, right? And I think time can be a player in that piece.
Yeah, and in time too, I think being able to recognize that our needs around grief might change too. And so how we interact with it might be different. Emily's touching on something that's called a continuing bond, that ability to continue a relationship with someone or something, could be a situation, after that loss has happened, so that we can still feel connected. The belief being that the relationship doesn't end just because there's a loss. That it can still exist, but it exists differently, and how do we do that? And thinking about, some different things that we might be able to do across time. One is, being able to have some narrative, kind of to talk about it. This is where people might find themselves journaling, or even contemplating the question, like, what will happen? Does it mean to me if I talk about this loss, however we identify it? There's also being able to go back and revisit, over time, we might create a memorial. Over time, we might go back to certain places that remind us of that person to feel connected again, that allow us to process and to make meaning. There's also the symbolic, it's called the metaphorical ways that we process over time. And that could be the continuing bond, that could be the pictures. Do we start to put pictures back up? Do we put them in different arrangement in our living space? And then thinking about, the support that we can give to ourselves or to other people. Sometimes we need people to do things for us. So like, can you go get groceries for me? Over time, that might change. I might need you to do grocery shopping in the immediate aftermath of a loss. Sometimes I just need someone to listen. And then other times I just need respite. Just need a break. Someone just come distract me. So allowing space for all of these different ways to interact with your grief over time, and that your needs may change moment to moment, but also from year to year and as time goes on.
Yeah, I think there's also, when in the grieving process, oftentimes like when there's a major loss, immediately a person can have a lot of support, like a lot of acknowledging, by people in their life. But then eventually those people move on with their life. They go back to their life, and you're left to still deal with it, And so like oftentimes people say it's maybe not even in the first couple months after a loss that are the hardest, but 6 months down the road, when a lot of other people have kind of stopped asking about the loss, or stopped checking in, or stopped offering help. And those times can feel really lonely. And so like in this, like when we're talking about time and the recovery process, I think it's really helpful to find communities that specifically understand and relate to what you're going through. That they are going to understand more than anyone. Like if it's like 2 years and you're still being confronted with like a part of the loss, it's like really difficult. So like having like support groups, or even if it's just a friend who who has gone through the same thing, it's really important to have that, and to like incorporate that as like a resource after loss.
Yeah, it's a really good point, Brenna. And I think a lot of the support's there in the immediate, and a lot of people find year 2 and year 3 is a little challenging, right? When the support is gone and they're still acutely experiencing the loss at holidays or important events for the family or their lives, and uncertainty about where or what to do about that. And so having support systems is really helpful.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, people who get it.
Mm-hmm.
So my next question is, this is a good transition. How can friends and family members best support a loved one who is grieving?
I think there's a lot of different ways for that, right? I think one is to just be very transparent, and like Melissa shared, like that their needs are going to change over time. And so really asking them, what do you need now? How can I be helpful? I want to be helpful to you. And with the experience you're going through, I think it may look different depending if it's a death or like a divorce or illness of some kind, right? Like those needs may look different. And so inviting the person into a conversation, I think, again, with children and younger people, right? Being mindful that they're having an experience too. And I believe that directness can be helpful, right? Rather than trying to be secretive or hiding it. Like Melissa mentioned earlier, right? Like the meaning making, kids make a lot of meaning of that. And when they don't have enough information to kind of anchor the meaning in, they can get really confused or they can blame themselves. And so, especially with young adults and kids, just being there and acknowledging you're going to have an emotional experience about this. I'm open and I'm happy to sit and talk with you or be present with you around it, or get you help. If you want some help or support, I'm here to listen.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, I can't emphasize having direct conversations enough. Because it also helps reduce any stigma that might be present. And it also doesn't like fragilize us, like we can talk about the loss, we can talk about the death if that's what it is. But it also does communicate that we are open to wanting to talk about it. It's not something that has to be tiptoed around. And there's just something that's so honoring and just validating to just say, this is what happened. And not using euphemisms for it, but just directly talking about it can actually be much more comforting than doing those indirect questions that we might ask because we don't want to upset the person, or we don't want to, make them feel anything. Chances are they're already feeling whatever it is you might be trying to avoid them feeling. You know, if they're already feeling upset, your question will not upset them. It might actually relieve them to know that somebody sees them and is saying, this is an okay thing to talk with me about.
Yeah, and kind of giving them permission to talk about, especially in a death, right? The person that they loved, that they've lost. I think people really do want to talk about that person and want to be able to connect around that person. And so being direct about it helps give them space for that.
Absolutely. And I think there are many ways to show up for a friend or family member if talking about it is difficult, like for you, or like if in a situation, maybe it hits too close to home, or it's just something that you feel uncomfortable talking. Like there are other ways of providing support, and like acts of service, or even just like being with the person more often, you know, and seeing, like, asking them what else do they like, what else can help them during this time. So
I think it's also important to recognize we all have a relationship with loss.
yeah.
That does get activated, whether we are aware of it or not, when we are with a loved one who's experienced a loss or a death, that our stuff is kind of getting kicked up too. And so also being mindful about maybe our knee-jerk reaction of what we want to offer, because sometimes what we are going to offer is what we want.
Yeah.
We would like, right? And so kind of pausing to say, like, why am I about to offer this? Because even the most well-intentioned words in grief can actually be really painful on the receiving end. You know, I think about some religious circles and they'll say, you know, everything happens for a reason. Well, that is a very difficult thing to hear when we're talking about suicide, or we talk about a fatal accident. We talk about infertility, and it just like creates these rabbit holes for people to be like, well, then why did I deserve this? And why this? And it's, you know, being mindful that what might comfort you may not comfort somebody else. And when the best thing we can do for a loved one when we are with them is understand what comforts them. And maybe it's acknowledging that there is nothing that will comfort them, but just knowing that someone's willing to sit with them while they're uncomfortable.
Yeah. Yeah, that's an important point. And I think too, there's a room and opportunity to check in with the person and bring ideas to the table, right? Like I think a lot of people when they're in grief or feeling really the immediate wake of it, right? A lot of people say, what can I do? And they're like, I can't even think about that. I don't know what I need right now. And you could show up with suggestions that get to what Melissa's saying, right? Like, how about I bring some dinner this week? Or can I take your child to school? Can I do XYZ? Are there phone calls I can make? Are there, you know, like bringing suggestions rather than this open-ended question that's overwhelming in a situation that's already overwhelming. I know I need something. I don't have the headspace or the bandwidth to think through what would be helpful right now.
That's so helpful, because it's true in the aftermath, like in the immediate aftermath of a loss. It is often the case that someone's like, I don't know what's happening. I can't answer too many texts right now. I can't answer, you know, it's just, so having to think in that way can be really difficult. And like for a friend to just be able to anticipate, you're probably going to need groceries this week. Let me go do that for you. You know, that can be super helpful.
Yeah. And that can apply to other situations too, right? Like I'm thinking of like a medical diagnosis or divorce, right? Like as somebody's transitioning out of a home or having a partner transition out of the home, right? Like, let me show up and do these things for you.
So that leads me to my next question. We just discussed like how best to support a grieving loved one. Do you have any specific advice for supporting a child dealing with the complicated emotions of grief and loss? I think that you two have both touched on that, but if you have anything else to offer, I'm curious about your thoughts.
I think the one thing I will add, right, is like not only like making space for the child's emotional experience, but I think a lot of times as parents or adults, we shield children from our own emotional experience. And, you know, I say it in a lot of different contexts, especially like divorce. Like a lot of parents try to shield their kids from the emotions that's happening between them as they're divorcing. And the kids are like little barometers. They're picking up on it. And then they don't know what to do with all that emotional experience that they feel around it. And so I think some of it is modeling your own emotions, right? Like allowing yourself to sit in your own emotional state. That's okay. I think it's helping the child understand that they're not responsible for then fixing it or making your emotion go away. Yes, mommy's sad. I'm so missing grandpa. And I'm going to work on that, and I'm going to be sad for a while. He was a big, important part of my world, and he was in yours too. And maybe you don't feel sad right now, and that's okay. You could feel something different about grandpa not being here anymore. And it's okay. I'm sad and you're feeling something else, right? It's like inviting this conversation, like we're going to talk about emotions and it's going to be okay. And you're not responsible for fixing mine. I think a lot of adults tiptoe around kids with the emotion because they don't want them to end up responsible for it. And you can just be, again, that directness, right? Like, this isn't yours to fix. It's okay, mommy's sad about this loss.
Well said.
I think the other thing that possibly could be helpful is informing other important spaces in the child's world, right? Like notifying the school that they're going through whatever the loss is or the grief, in case it impacts academic performance, in case it impacts socialization, right? Some kids withdraw from social circles. Sharing with the parents of their friends, maybe informing activities, right? And I'm a big believer in creativity. And so maybe offering more creative spaces for kids, whether that's art or music or just free unstructured play to metabolize some of the emotions that they're experiencing could be helpful too.
I think in addition to that, probably one of the more complicating factors for kids too is just their development in terms of like what their brains can actually understand. And so to go back to that question about time, you know, allowing for the space that over time they may be re-interacting with that death and that loss as they age, as they gain the ability to think more abstractly, as they begin to think about the world more and the impact of losses, you know, so allowing for their development in relation to grief as time goes on too, I think is going to be an important context that this is an ongoing conversation that can be had, but that they may from one year to the next have a very different feeling about maybe the divorce or the death of someone or some other loss, right? Like, let's say it's a move. That's a loss for a child. And so that might also then change as time goes on, as well as as they develop.
Yeah, that's a really important one, especially in the context of divorce. And if parents are re-entering relationships, right, that may activate for the child grief when the parent is feeling something more akin to like elation or happiness, right? And children don't know what to do with that, right? Like, and like you're naming, it could be different when they're 8 and going through it versus 16 when you're remarrying, right? But approaching it from a developmentally appropriate stage is helpful.
Yeah. And depending on like the school system, there can be counselors at the school, like school therapists. And so that's also, I appreciated, Emily, you said it might be helpful to let the school know, the teacher, they could be able to provide like additional support for the child in that setting.
Yeah, absolutely. And thinking through, you know, I'm thinking of a friend of mine whose neighbor passed away and her children were really close to the neighbor. And so at first, you know, she didn't think that it was that impactful and didn't inform the school, but the school started to notice a change in behavior and actually came to the parent and was like, hey, what is going on here? And it allowed my friend the opportunity to step back and be like, oh my gosh, I didn't realize how impactful this loss was for my kids. And having that school be there to partner with them.
So my next question, I'm wondering if you can speak a bit more about like the different instances in which ambiguous grief can occur.
Sorry, I took a big sigh because I'm like, there are so many places we can start. So it's such,
very true.
you know, and I work only with adults, so I kind of want to caveat that as I'm about to name some of these. You know, for some adults that I work with, they are grieving parents who are still alive, but were not the parents they wanted, were not the parents they needed. Sometimes that even gets more complicated when they see those parents become grandparents and then give what they wanted. There's like another element of grief there about, oh, there is a possibility that this person exists, but now grieving the loss that they did not get that person. Which is always amazing to my clients, that they, as adults, can grieve living parents, and that there's an opportunity for that. I've also, you know, experienced when parents, maybe they wait till the child or children are 18 and older and the parent comes out as part of the LGBTQ community. So there's grief and loss in that. Relationships ending, whether these are friendships, whether they're romantic, sometimes it's even familial relationships. Sometimes as we age, even losing certain abilities. When I work with older adults, there's the grief of loss of their independence and who they knew themselves to be, what their previous capabilities were, but now what they actually see their limitations are. Various health diagnoses that can come later in life, whether it's cancer, cognitive decline, Alzheimer's, dementia. Emily.
Yeah, I think you're hitting a lot of the major ones, right? And I think there's also, when we have traumatic events occur to us, there is a reorganization and a grief of who we thought we would be or could be. That traumatic event sets us on a course. And then recently I've been experiencing a lot of clients with autoimmune disorders. And so it's this really ambiguous gray medical thing. And so they're grieving having a concrete diagnosis, like something's happening in my body, but I don't have anything to anchor it in. And so like, how do I make meaning of this? And so they're grieving having certainty. How does this look longer term? And that can be true of any ongoing longer term illness. And then I think divorce and relationship reconfiguration is a huge one, particularly for kids, right? Like that reorganization of who's our family, what does this mean? But that can happen anytime there's some loss. And I would actually even suggest sometimes when having new members enter a family, it can send a family system into grief, right? Like we no longer do these things that we once did, right? Traditions change as new members enter, whether they're babies or partners, right? Like as kids grow, there's a lot of change in family systems. And again, there's that narrative, it should be a happy time. And so people get caught off guard if they're feeling a sense of grief because the change should be quote unquote happy. And they're experiencing a loss around it. Trying to think if there's other really big major ones. I think cognitive decline is a big one for families, right? Because it's not only those important pieces that Melissa named of like losing part of yourself and getting to know yourself as an older adult aging, right? But there is also the family experiencing, this isn't the person we knew. This person's different. And so we're grieving the actual person we knew and the loss of that person, but we're also grieving the actual impending decline that's coming too.
Yeah, I'm being mindful of time. We have one more question. What suggestions do you have for those who are grieving and finding themselves in the dark, like isolated place? How can they effectively reach out and reconnect with their loved ones during this challenging time?
I'm gonna let you go first, Melissa. That's a really complex one, right?
That
Yeah.
is.
And I feel like I'm going to respond with the most simple one-word answer, but being able to feel any connection, whether it's connection with our support groups, how we integrate with them, how we reach out to them. And really this idea that I mentioned a little bit ago about a continuing bond, it can look like anything that allows us to be connected with whoever or whatever has been lost, ambiguous lost or very definitive person loss, that allows us to feel connected with that experience. It allows us to honor ourselves. It allows us to honor that person, and it can change over time. You know, some people that I've worked with, they will set aside a specific time during the day where they just like go and they talk to or they journal to the person, and over time that changes. Maybe they don't do that anymore, but they might go out to the favorite restaurant on the anniversary of a loss. It's a way to still feel connected. Maybe they order the meal that that person always got. You know, it's allowing yourself to be as creative as possible to feel connection, because at the end of the day, grief is so individual. So whatever it is that allows you to feel connected, whether it makes sense to somebody else or not, is not the point. It's, does it make sense to you, and do you feel connected? And being able to tell your supports what you need. And I think as loved ones who are on the side of like wanting to be supportive, being okay if our outreach for help is actually refused. Because sometimes we just need to be alone and respect that, but still feel connected in some way. Allowing that space to reach out, but also allowing that space to say, I do need something, but in this moment I need to be alone, but I will connect with you. I'm trying to think. All of my mind just keeps going to just being connected. Because the loss does not mean that everything has ended. It might feel like everything has ended, but really it has changed. And so how do we feel connected amidst that change?
Yeah, it's making me think there's this lovely little kid's book called The Invisible String. And it's about a kid going off to school, but the mom talks about the invisible string that connects their hearts. And it talks about, you know, all these various scenarios where that string still exists. And so it's, how do you create your string and your connection, right? That continuing bond. And it can look like a lot of different things. And I think also for the person that is worried or concerned about their loved one who's grieving and kind of isolating, it's making sure not to make too much meaning, to go back to that, right? That meaning making, that it's okay if that person pulls away right now, that is okay, and not internalizing it and taking it to mean something personal about them and the support that they're offering.
One interesting little caveat that I'll make is thinking about the losses with family members or situations that might be estranged or disenfranchised, and that ability to feel connected actually feels very conflicting, or the opportunity for that is gone or not safe to do. And so thinking about ways that, this is where a lot of different like journaling and writing interventions sometimes come in, but allowing yourself to maybe write what you always wished you could have said, write yourself the letter that you wish you received from that person. It does get really complicated, but I don't want to overshadow that there's also much harder losses that are disenfranchised or estranged that exist out there. And there's still the need for connection, but there's something really beautiful and I think powerful when we are really estranged, actually, that you then can write the narrative. What do you want that narrative to look like of the relationship? Because again, it's you going through the grieving process. So what do you want that connection to be? Is it a final letter? Is that Is that your lasting connection? That I finally wrote everything? Is it that I finally received the letter I've always wanted? And that's the relationship I now have. And so really just whatever it is you might need and however it looks
Mhm.
is
Thank
what
you.
is like most important.
Yeah. Yeah, really appreciate everything that you both have shared. So meaningful. And I believe there's some questions, and I'm not sure if Crystal, this is where I think you jump in to facilitate some of those questions.
Yes, thank you for this very important discussion. We have a lot of questions that came in before in the chat here live, so we'll try to answer as many as we can. So thank you all for submitting them. One of the questions that came in before the webinar is, do you have any suggestions to help someone prepare for an impeding loss?
I would probably say that a lot of the things we shared with an actual loss are relevant, right? That you know, like Melissa's loss list is really helpful even in that context. And I think again, giving yourself permission to feel whatever emotions you're feeling. I think especially with anger, that can be really complex if the person's still here, right? Like, I have precious time, why am I angry at them? And giving yourself space to really sit down and maybe mindfully attend to that, whether it's like journaling or making space for yourself too. You know, what do you need in this moment or time, particularly if you're a caregiver?
Thank you. Can you say something about the value of grief?
It's a really good question. um,
To move through it is it kind of coming back to that meaning making process. Like, it's important that people actually address grief and move through it in order to have a more integrated way of understanding the world after a major loss, rather than to try to just persist as if nothing happened, because something major did happen. And there can be a lot of like beautiful emotions that come along with grief as well, like in terms of like connecting with people, remembering that like the person or the experience in like in different ways. That's what's coming to mind for me. I don't know if Emily or Melissa want to share anything, the value of it.
I find it invaluable because when we feel grief, regardless of how complicated the situation is or not, it's telling us that there was a meaningful attachment and connection that was present, that deserves to be honored and deserves to be explored and to be sat with, and that there was love there. Again, even if it was a very complicated situation, or today we've talked about some stigmatized deaths or disenfranchised losses, but the grief lets us know that we were and are living and breathing and experiencing this world, and there's some attachment that has now changed. And fundamentally, as humans, when we have any type of change in our attachment to anything that means something to us, that's where value is. That's what gives us a feedback loop about life and about ourselves and about how the world works. And so I think it's so valuable. And I think why a lot of us shy away maybe from stages and focus more on allowing it to be an ongoing, no timetable. It exists and it's going to change, because it's so important.
Thank you. We had a couple of questions worded differently, but just advice do you have for someone who is grieving multiple losses simultaneously? And one maybe is for if a younger person maybe loses both of their parents and they don't have, their peers don't understand because they still have their parents. So kind of two questions in one, but both about simultaneous loss.
That can be a really challenging experience, is feeling alone in that experience, you know, and not having many people who quite understand the extent of the pain. And I think it's like in those situations, finding support groups, like grief-related support groups, can be very helpful.
Yeah, and there's a lot of grief support groups that are categorized, right? Like, so there, I know that the Chicagoland area has some fantastic grief groups for people who have lost loved ones to suicide or lost parents at a young age, right? There are a lot of support tools out there that can be a little more tailored to the situation you're in. It's also making me think of what Melissa shared earlier about the assumptive nature of things, right? And I think especially when we've had multiple losses, that's where it's really helpful to step back around those things and that moralistic narrative that our culture sometimes can push on stuff that, you know, good things happen to good people and bad things happen to bad people. And when you're sitting in multiple losses, it's like, I must be a really bad person for this to keep happening to me, and stepping back from those kind of assumptions and narratives.
And we have time for one more question. It actually kind of builds on that. What you said, how do you deal with the losses that you feel may be unfair?
Think what's coming to my mind is anger can be mobilizing, and it can be transformative. It can be in terms of like when things just don't make sense and they seem really unfair, like unjust. That is like a uniquely challenging experience, having to make sense of a world in like where there's like this injustice, and I think that there can be ways to empower yourself. And yeah, I think I'll give Emily and Melissa also a chance to answer this as well.
I think sometimes diving into what makes it unfair, just so we can understand, why does this feel unfair? And thinking, is there a way that it could be made fair, or is it about justice? You know, kind of what would be the flip side of this? And is there an individual way that we could bring a sense of fairness, right? But this all goes to that idea of, how do we make sense of the loss, right? How do I make sense of an unfair loss in my life? And how can I maybe honor that? And is it on a communal level? Is it on a national level? Is it something more individual that I do every day, that allows me to bring a sense of fairness or justice, in keeping that person alive, right? Do I go and I talk about them? Do I keep them alive that way? Do I introduce them? How do I introduce them? And so that's where my mind is going.
Yeah, I would probably agree with both of you. You know, it's the meaning that gets made of that, and maybe taking the time to slow down and unpack it. And it goes back to that piece you said earlier, Melissa, or like sometimes it doesn't make sense and it just won't. You know, I'm thinking of the loss of children, traumatic events. You know, I'm thinking a lot about the people over in the Middle East right now, right? Like that, I'm sure it feels very unjust to the people living through it in the moment and the harm. And it's difficult to make meaning of that. And it's okay to try to take it piece by piece, day by day too. I think that's the other part of when it feels really unjust, it can feel overwhelming. And so slowing it down and just taking it one step at a time can be really helpful. What do I have to do today?
That's really good. Thank you. I want to thank all of you, all of our panel, and thank everyone that joined us. We will be sharing the recording with everyone. So thank you again, and have a good afternoon.
Thank you.
Bye, everyone.